Well, welcome everyone. I want to welcome you to this special coffee hour, a special edition. It's not even a Friday. We'll just make it pretend that it is a Friday for those of us that are working. I'm Lynn Giacobbe. I'm the CEO of Kendal at Home. And we're so glad you could join us for this series of talks designed to inform and engage you on a variety of topics from arts and culture to current affairs. And members and their guests and prospective members of Kendal at Home are always welcome to join us, and we hope you'll do so often. I don't know about you, but I think that thanks to Paul, we've been able to have so many really interesting guests. And I also want to thank the Friends Foundation for the Aging for the generous grant in support of this special programming. Something that we launched during the pandemic that now has become a part of Kendal at Home and what we'll offer probably forever, I hope. But at the end of today's coffee hour, I'll share with you a little bit about our next event, which is on June 23rd. But in the meantime, what I'd really like to do is just let you all know that if you are listening today and have questions or thoughts that you want to share with Russell, please feel free to type those in the chat or in the questions and answers, and then we'll get to those at the end. But most importantly, I want to introduce to you Russell Gurr. You're in for a treat today. Maybe not as much of a treat as we got to see, because we got to see the little baby too. But we are so happy to have you here with us. Russell is an Australian conductor based in New York. His broad repertoire spans orchestral, operatic, and choral music, which he has conducted across Europe, North America, and his home country of Australia. Since 2016, he's been the music director of the Great Newburgh Symphony Orchestra in the Hudson Valley, where he conducts 6 subscription concerts each season, in addition to family and pops concerts. And he has a lasting tie to our friends in Boston, having been a student at the Boston Conservatory. So I'm going to let Russell tell you more about himself, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Russell, to talk to us today about Leonard Bernstein.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here at Kendal at Home. May I please have permission to share my screen?
You may.
Thank you. Okay. So, today's subject is one of my favorites, Leonard Bernstein, who some of you may remember, some of you may have seen him on TV in the Young People's Concert, some of you may have even been to the Young People's Concerts. I came across Lenny from faraway Australia when I was a student, and I just fell in love with him, with his energy, with his passion, with his dynamism, with his charisma, with his intelligence, and also with his approachability, so much so that I had posters of him up in my bedroom, where most young people of my age had film stars or pop musicians. I had pictures of Lenny that I'd photocopied and enlarged from a conducting textbook. So let us dive in. To someone with seemingly infinite talents like Bernstein, the looming question constantly remained for him, which path to take. Here is a quote from Lenny at age 40. "I don't want to give in and settle for some specialty. I don't want to spend the rest of my life, as Toscanini did, studying and restudying, say, the same 50 pieces of music. It would bore me to death. I want to conduct. I want to play the piano. I want to write music for Broadway and for Hollywood. I want to write symphonic music. I want to teach. I want to write books and poetry, and I think I can and still do justice to them all." That is the question that we're exploring today. To what extent did he do them justice in not one, but 5 careers that he ended up having in his single lifetime? Then he was one of those people that only slept a very little bit and spent most of his time being productive. So, first is his career as a pianist, which is where his life began as a musician, as we will see. Bernstein performs major concerti with major symphony orchestras, including the Beethoven piano concertos, the Gershwin Rhapsody in Blue, for which he became famous, the Grieg Piano Concerto, many Mozart piano concerti, the very jazzy and Gershwin-inspired Ravel Piano Concerto, the Shostakovich Piano Concerto. And he did these large pianistic works with the most estimable and lauded symphony orchestras on the planet: the Vienna Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic, the Israel Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony, and others. So you can see that he's got a very definitive role as a pianist, such that many others would be, that would suffice for them, simply just to have that acclaim and that aplomb as an instrumentalist. However, Lenny, as he said, was not going to be content with just one, so he was also this great composer. And from the outset, he composes serious music alongside Broadway and film music. So at age 24, he writes his first symphony, which is almost immediately picked up by his teachers, Serge Koussevitzky and Fritz Reiner at the Boston Symphony and the Pittsburgh Symphony, respectively. And he starts to get traction as an important young voice on the American symphonic scene. A couple of years later, he writes the ballet Fancy Free, which he expands into both a musical and a film. The musical is On the Town, and the film then goes on to star Frank Sinatra. So already at such a young age, he's got massive success under his belt. He writes a serious opera, Trouble in Tahiti, at the age of 34. In 1954, he writes the score to the fantastic Marlon Brando film On the Waterfront with that inimitable line, "I could have been a contender," for which he is then nominated for an Oscar. In 57, before the age of 40, he writes West Side Story, which obviously becomes his most well-known and famous work. In 63, he writes another symphony. He's already written one in between, the Third Symphony, which is the Kaddish. In 65, he writes what goes on to be his most probably widely performed concert work, which is the Chichester Psalms for a choir and orchestra. And then in 71, for the opening of the Kennedy Center, he writes Mass. He was very close to the Kennedy, so it's very appropriate that he wrote something for its opening. Then, of course, is the career for which he becomes most famous and most well known to the public, which is as a conductor. As a conductor in 39, he meets, while he's studying at Harvard, he meets Aaron Copland, who is America's most important compositional voice ever, I would make the assertion. Copland really finds the American voice, and every American composer in his wake has been indebted to him in one way or another. Lenny meets Copland at a party at Harvard, immediately recognizes him, sits down at a piano and plays for Copland one of Copland's piano sonatas. Copland is immediately drawn to Lenny's exuberance and his obvious skill and talent, and Copland and Lenny become close friends for the rest of Lenny's life. Bernstein, on the strength of Copland's recommendation, is admitted to the inaugural conducting class of Fritz Reiner at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. Fritz Reiner is this hawkish Hungarian Jewish conductor whose beady eyes overlooked this hawk-like nose, and he used to conduct with a very large baton and very minimal movements, and he was an absolute master on the podium. He became, after Pittsburgh, he went on to be one of the most important shapers of the American orchestral sound with the Chicago Symphony. Reiner was a past master, and one of the stories that Lenny tells is that Reiner would stop him in his conducting class at Curtis and say, "Wait, what is the second clarinet doing right now?" So Reiner instilled in Bernstein this deep-founded requirement and need to know the score intimately, which has to demonstrate and evince this great respect for the composer, the notes, and the score. Based on Reiner's, and you can see, Lenny met Copland, who introduces him to Reiner. Reiner then recommends him to Koussevitzky, who has founded the Tanglewood School of Music, which is the summer home of the Boston Symphony. And Lenny goes on to form this incredibly father and son-like intimate relationship with Koussevitzky for the rest of Koussevitzky's life. Lenny used to wear, for the rest of his career, cufflinks that Koussevitzky gave him, and before every performance, there are photos of this backstage, where Lenny kisses Koussevitzky's cufflinks. And Reiner and Koussevitzky couldn't be more opposed in their nature and character. Reiner is this Apollonian. He is disciplined. He is about clarity. He is about knowledge. Koussevitzky is this very, very warm-hearted, old-school European, Russian, aristocratic gentleman. And he's very soft-natured, even though he has this iron will that he imposes on the orchestra. But he does it in a very gentle way. So Koussevitzky is this Dionysian, inspirational kind of character who gives Lenny the kind of nurturing that he didn't have from his own father. At Reiner's and Koussevitzky's invitation, Bernstein goes to both Pittsburgh and Boston, these great venerable symphonic institutions, to conduct Lenny's own Jeremiah Symphony. So you can see that his compositional career and his conducting career are wed to one another. He is appointed assistant conductor at the age of 25 to the New York Philharmonic, and Bruno Walter, one of the great luminaries of conducting, falls ill, and Lenny steps in at the last minute for him. And you can see how the cultural landscape in America has shifted, because in 1943, Bernstein stepping in for an ailing Walter, was front page news across the country. It was broadcast on the radio. The New York Times, the LA Times, everyone ran it as this great wunderkind that had stepped in for the great Maestro. 15 years later, approximately, Lenny is eventually appointed music director of the New York Philharmonic, the first American born to head a major orchestra in the United States. And then in the 60s, he goes on to form this very intimate relationship with the Vienna Philharmonic, and we'll explore more of that later. In the fourth iteration of his career, Lenny is the great educator. And nowhere more so is this apparent than in his television series, the Omnibus series that he starts for, which we'll talk about in a second as well. And the very first telecast you can see on this page, he had this brilliant idea to blow up the front page, the first page of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, to life size, put it on the floor, and then put instrumentalists onto the page, as you can see, where the instruments themselves are written. So immediately you have this incredibly arresting visual that you can relate to understand all those complex hieroglyphics that are the score. He then goes on to write and perform 53 of the Young People's Concerts on CBS in prime time. And one of the reasons that he has such far-reaching cultural implications is because as television was coming of age, so was Bernstein, and he had this great idea to televise these TV specials where he interpolates explanation with the music, which is how he goes on to cause an entire generation of Americans to fall in love with the symphony orchestra. In the 70s, he goes to his alma mater, Harvard, and he's invited to serve for a year as a guest intellectual in the Charles Eliot Norton lectures that he delivers, which are again televised. He calls them the unanswered question, which is a reference to one of Charles Ives's, which is another American composer, one of his pieces of music. And Bernstein goes on this incredibly complex and deep dive into an argument that music possesses the same characteristics as does language. And he goes through a Chomskyan kind of linguistic dissection of music as a language. It's fascinating. It's quite difficult, and it's very, very dense. I've watched it a number of times. I've bought the transcript, and I still only just wrap my head around it. Such is the staggering size of Bernstein's intellect. Here is a little glimpse of one of the young people's concerts.
Did you ever feel that you wanted something more than anything else in the world, and you said so, and they said, no, you can't have it, and you said again, I want it, and again they said no, and again you said louder and more excited, I want it, and again louder, I want it, until it seemed that something would break in your head and there's nothing left to do but cry. Well, that's like this music. Listen. I want it. 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 And finally something breaks in your head and you cry. Now listen to the orchestra play it and see if you don't feel something like those emotions.
You cannot think of a more ingenious way to introduce people, whether they be children or adults, whether they be neophytes or professionals, to this music. There is something so exhilarating about hearing the way that it's put together and hearing some interpretation of it that is aligned with a particular feeling or a particular mood or a particular idea, and then hearing someone explain that, and then hearing the orchestra render it. That's one of the, and just remember, it had never been done before. So Lenny's way of approaching this was, in itself evidence of his genius. Then, of course, there is Lenny the writer. And many of his writings are transcripts from speeches he made or musings that he had. But here is an extract from the book, The Joy of Music. And you can show again, it shows his love of language, his capacity for thought. So ultimately, one must accept the loving fact that people enjoy listening to organized sound. That this enjoyment can take the form of all kinds of responses, from animal excitement to spiritual exaltation. And that people who can organize sound so as to evoke the most exalted responses are commonly called geniuses. These axioms can neither be denied nor explained, but in the great tradition of man burrowing through the darkness with his mind, hitting his head on cave walls, and sometimes perceiving a pinpoint of light, we can at least try to explain. It's so that, and that you can just see is a manifesto for his whole young people's concerts. Here's another excerpt from The Infinite Variety of Music. He published in the New York Times a sabbatical report. In his 7th year, he took a year off to compose from his music director duties at the New York Philharmonic. For hours on end, I brooded and mused on materiae musicae, used and abused, on aspects of unconventionality, over the death in our time of tonality, over the fads of dada and chance, the serial strictures, the death of romance, perspectives in music, the new terminology, a physico-mathematico-musicology, pieces called cycles and signs and parameters, titles too beat for these homely tetrameters, pieces for nattering, clucking sopranos with squadrons of vibraphones, fleets of pianos, played with the forearms, the fists and the palms. And then I came up with the Chichester Psalms. These psalms are a simple and modest affair, tonal and tuneful and somewhat square, certain to sicken a stout John Cager with its tonics and triads in B-flat major. But there it stands, the result of my pondering, 2 long months of avant-garde wandering, my youngest child, old-fashioned and sweet, and he stands on his 2 tonal feet. Just to put that into context, John Cage famously composed a piece of music called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is where a pianist sits at the piano, opens the lid and closes it for the 3 movements, and it's timed to last 4 minutes and 33 seconds. They don't play a note on the piano. The music that happens is the accidental chant music that happens in the concert hall from people shuffling, shifting, coughing, sirens outside, etc. So, certain to sicken a stout John Cager, Lenny was the opposite of that avant-garde kind of style. Even though he tried it, he never really believed in it. So, musical life begins at the piano, and there's a story that Lenny tells in characteristic self-aggrandizement. He indulges his own mythology. He says, I didn't grow up in a particularly cultured house, and then one day I walked into my aunt's house and they had purchased a piano, and it sat illuminated by a beam and a shaft of light coming through the window, and it seemed to call to me, and I walked over with hands outstretched and placed my hands on the keys and felt at home. So Lenny was drawn to the piano, he was drawn to music. Here are 3 examples of him in his very first career as a pianist. This is the Ravel Piano Concerto. This is the Gershwin, one of his showpieces. You can see he's predisposed to popular jazzy rhythmic stuff. Okay, we're going to move right along. Then there is Lenny, the creative artist. Both serious and show music. So let's first dissect the problem that he has to encounter by being a serious, in inverted commas, American composer. American classical music is inherently problematic. The reason being that serious music or classical music, symphonic music, is a paradox if it's American, because it's originally a European art form. Therefore, by definition, it is somewhat derivative. Which means that America in Lenny's time still remains a kind of orchestral colonial outpost. And so, true innovation in America has to come from the native language of the country, the native musical language of the country. And America is uniquely endowed with two particular musical languages. The first is jazz, which is an outgrowth of African American spirituals, and then that becomes the blues and that becomes jazz, and Broadway. And Broadway itself evolves from comic opera to Singspiel in the late 19th century, to vaudeville and cabaret in the early 20th century, and then ultimately to musical theatre as we recognize it, Gershwin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, etc., in the middle of the 20th century. Lenny attempts both because he is schooled in serious music and he has a passion for theatre music. So, the serious music. Lenny's staunchest critic was an academic and a writer for the New York Times called Harold C. Schonberg. In 1967, he writes, Bernstein's serious music has not been accepted by other conductors. It is kept alive mainly through Bernstein's own performances. A 2018 centenary examination of one of his works reads as follows. If Mass, from 1971, is not Bernstein's worst work, it surely reflects his worst tendencies. His allergy to self-editing, his saccharine streak, his embarrassing wordplay, his obsession with and tone deafness toward youth culture, his weak counterfeits of pop styles. So that is a very damning examination of one of Lenny's most highly criticized works, Mass. But let's have a look at the symphonic style as it exists in the concert hall. It is tonal and triadic in nature, which means that it sounds like it belongs. It's somewhat anachronistic. It sounds a little bit old-fashioned, especially when you compare it to the kind of really avant-garde, out there stuff that was being written in the 50s and 60s in America. Lenny's sounds very old-fashioned. But Lenny was being true to himself, which I admire. He uses a modern approach to harmony where there is a free kind of use of chromaticism, but the dominant aesthetic characteristic remains rhythm and asymmetry. Lenny writes to his wife one day in a letter something about, in West Side Story, he was talking about the song that the tenor sings, Something's Coming. And he says, it's this lovely little tune, but I can't help, I won't say what Lenny writes, he says, I can't help but screw around with the meter and the pulse and keep adding a beat and dropping a beat here and there, which gives it this asymmetry, which is part of his own particular vernacular. The last piece is that it's programmatic. All three of his symphonies, the Jeremiah, the Age of Anxiety, and the Kaddish are all programmatic. They each have they have associations outside of the music themselves. Here is an excerpt from Jeremiah.
The Jeremiah Symphony, written in 1942, it commemorates a great moment in Jewish history, the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. The first movement, Prophecy, is a picture of somehow the pleading of Jeremiah with his people. The second movement, Profanation, is about the chaos and confusion, and it's a very quite aggressive and busy piece of music having to do with corruption, the corruption of the people.
You can see how rhythmic this is.
And then
So you can see that there are the hallmarks already in that early symphony, which you remember he composed at the age of 24. There are already the hallmarks of some of the things that will go on to make his theatrical exploration of West Side Story so successful. Of course, it is the ultimate Leonard Bernstein piece because it went on to be so very popular. One of the reasons for its popularity is the combination, the very successful synthesis of three very different styles: classical, jazz, and Latin American. The classical elements is the orchestra itself, the instruments. He uses the strings of the orchestra, he uses woodwinds, clarinets, oboes, and flutes, which are much more associated with the symphonic orchestra than with jazz, which is predominantly trumpets, trombones, and that all the more so with Latin American music. He uses motivic development to build tension. This is a very classical approach to treating material. It's not just that you've got a particular lovely tune, it's the way that he treats those melodies and those little snippets of melody is that the development that they undergo is very classical. The rhythmic displacements are also another classical technique, and then the use of unusual intervals. The tritone, Maria, that's called the tritone, and then there's a place for, that's a minor seventh. These aren't particularly dominant intervals especially in pop music, but you do find them proliferate in classical music. The jazz elements are, of course, the heavy use of saxophones, of trumpets, of trombones, and the drum set itself. The rhythm is swung. The difference between swung and straight is as follows. Normal eighth notes go like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Jazz eighth notes go like this. Do, va, do, va, do, va, do, va. Long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short. And Lenny had to find a way to be able to write this swung style, this syncopated style for pit musicians, which were going to be classically trained musicians who were playing in a theatre pit, which is the part of the stage beneath where the musicians sit. And so he had to be very creative, and he came up with a very creative solution, which was to write it in 6/8. So instead of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, he wrote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because inherent in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he could write like this. 1, 3, 4, da do, da do, da do, da do, which is an inbuilt swing for players who didn't know how to do it, who weren't jazz trained players. The other is that he uses the combination at the same time of polytonality, two different tonal areas at the same time, which we'll explore in a second. The last element, the Latin American element, of course, the most obvious is the actual genres themselves. He uses a cha-cha, he uses a mambo, but then also the heavy use of percussion, like the congas and the bongos and the ratchets and the guiros, all of these instruments which evoke a Latin American dance music, he now puts into the theatre pit orchestra, as well as the heavy syncopations. Have a look at this excerpt from the Symphonic Dances with the wonderful conductor Gustavo Dudamel conducting. Sorry, I should just say at the outset, the reason I'm playing this particular clip is because it shows all three elements at the same time. It's symphonic in its instrumentation, it's symphonic in its treatment of motives, it's Latin American and jazzy in its use of the different genres and the instruments and the style. So have a listen. Very jazzy drums, obviously. Very Latin American. It's so infectious, isn't it? Then there's a particular piece straddling the divide, which is Chichester Psalms, which goes on to become one of his most performed concert works. And the Dean of Chichester, who commissioned the work, said to him, and of course, we would love it if you included some of that wonderful West Side Story style. So Lenny certainly went ahead and did that. Here's me with my orchestra performing the opening of Chichester Psalms. his colleagues was a composer named Jack Gottlieb, who says, while Jeremiah, the First Symphony, offers only consolation and not a solution to the existential crisis, Bernstein's creative journey through the Second Symphony, Age of Anxiety, and the Third Symphony, the Kaddish, through Chichester Psalms in 65, and finally Mass in 71, it led him to a profound conclusion that a renewal of faith in modern times, because Lenny was permanently questioning whether he was a nihilist or a deist, a theist, whether he believed in God or whether he was actually an atheist. Modern times requires a return to innocence, a shedding of the trappings of dogma and orthodoxy, and a fundamental belief in our common humanity. Here is the hymn-like ending of Chichester Psalm, which is exalting mankind sitting together next to each other in their tents in peace and harmony. And what we learn from this particular excerpt is that Bernstein spent his career creatively and as a performer trying to come to terms, as all great artists do. They use their art to come to terms with their own existential struggle. Here is an exploration now of the Maestro career, the thing for which Lenny became most famous, which is his work on the podium. The British critic Norman Lebrecht writes, in 1957, when he takes over the New York Philharmonic, his orchestral experience was minuscule. He came onto the market during the McCarthy witch hunt, when his leftist sympathies, homoerotic inclinations, and racial origins made him virtually unemployable in America, particularly in a conservative stronghold as left and intellectually curious and stimulating as Boston is, and I know because I studied there and I loved the city, it is a bastion of America's bluest blood. It is one of the cradles of America's democracy and sees that role as sacrosanct. And so for a young bisexual man who was Jewish, Boston is probably not going to be the ideal place in the 1950s. However, the New York Philharmonic is. And both the New York Philharmonic and Bernstein needed each other. Bernstein needed an orchestra and somewhere to promote his serious musical training and to give it expression. And the New York Philharmonic, which was an ailing institution in the 50s, that had started to have a vast attrition of its audience, needed someone that was going to be approachable and reflective of New York at the time. The way that Bernstein serves the New York Philharmonic, delivers innumerable recording contracts and all of these TV appearances, is through his Omnibus Young People's series. And that's because Lenny recognized very quickly how TV could be utilized and harnessed for the promotion of that which he loved most. So Lenny is a modern man for a modern age. He replaced the received image of the conductor as remote, foreign, European autocrat with a self-portrait of the maestro as a young American, a jazz-loving, wisecracking, boogie-playing, self-deprecating fellow. These are the famous conductors of the day. In the top left, Herbert von Karajan. Top right, Leopold Stokowski. In the center, Lenny's own teacher, Fritz Reiner. The bottom left, his other teacher, Serge Koussevitzky. And the bottom right, the great disciplinarian, George Zell. And just look at those portraits compared to the young, sweaty, jumping, t-shirt wearing Leonard Bernstein. So, of course, this leads to a meteoric rise and let's have a look at some of the critical contemporary reception from his work as a conductor at the day. It has been said, says Harold C. Schonberg, his arch nemesis at the New York Times, that nobody loves him but the public. A perpetual wunderkind, a wonder child. He managed to give the impression of eternal youth, and that was still true when he was almost 50. Another critic, Irving Kolodin, says in 1964, towards the end of Lenny's tenure at the New York Philharmonic, of the promise he had 20 years ago, speaking of his debut with the Philharmonic when he stepped in for the ailing Walter. Speaking of his promise as a conductor, the judgment from this bench would be that it has spread wider, but it has not penetrated more deeply. What we see is this repeated accusation of style over substance. He is a specialist in the clenched fist, the hip swivel, the pelvic thrust, the levitation effect that makes him hover in the air in defiance of gravity, the uppercut, the haymaker. These wild motions convince many that there is more to the choreography than to the music. You can see everything that Schonberg is leveling at Lenny in that clip. However, in a piece like Shostakovich and in so much of the repertoire that was really in Lenny's wheelhouse, and not all of it was, but that which was, Lenny was so magnetic and so passionate and convincing that Schonberg's accusations ring empty. However, when you apply that same aesthetic approach to some serious music, as we're about to do, then they hold up. So this is another critical analysis. Mr. Bernstein's way with the orchestral score is at its best masterly, flowing, dramatic, sensuous, yet never mannered, yet moments of profound insight blend with blandness, competence, and mere superficiality. And neither the orchestral playing nor the recorded sound is truly arresting. And then another one from Schonberg, his performance of the classics through Brahms have never been fully accepted. At least Schonberg has the grace to acknowledge this. Where his ideas about Stravinsky, Strauss, Shostakovich, and Bartók can be brilliant and sure-footed, his ideas about earlier music have struck many as mannered and wayward. His interpretations are often vulgar, going for cheap external effects. The next video is a cross-compilation of Bernstein and the other great conducting luminary of the day, Herbert von Karajan, the music director for 30 years of the Berlin Philharmonic. What you see in this clip is Bernstein, all the things that Schonberg and Rockwell and Kolodin are saying, is that Lenny tends to prioritize musical expedience, loudness, and drama for substance. And what you see from Karajan, who is steeped in Germanic orchestral tradition with one of the great orchestras on the planet, is you see a long arching phrase, you see depth of orchestral timbre, you see taking time for sound to bloom and blossom. So you see, in other words, a European versus an American. You see the slickness and the immediacy of Bernstein and the depth and profundity of Karajan. Let's have a look. same passage. Listen to the depth. Watch their distance. Hear the difference now. Emanating from Arian's diaphragm. Lenny's a lot of the time up above his shoulders. Same passage. Listen to the way that Karajan lets it sit. Meditative. Listen to the resonance. Wait, the depth. There were two rival conductors at the turn of the 20th century, the great German Wilhelm Furtwängler and the great Italian Arturo Toscanini, and they were arch rivals. And one of the things that Furtwängler always criticized Toscanini about was being nothing more than an Italian bandmaster. Everything was too fast, everything was too shallow. And one of the analogies that Furtwängler, this great thinking, philosophical, old world kind of German, said that particularly in Brahms, it should be, those giant chords should sound like uprooting oak trees, century-old oak trees. And instead, in Toscanini's hands, they sound like the mere popping of champagne corks. That's the way that I think of Lenny and Karajan at the end of that. You can hear there's this great depth and resonance in Karajan's sound, which Bernstein lacks. We'll talk more about that in a second as we converge on some other ideas. It was particularly in certain repertoire. As I said, in that more modern 20th century repertoire, Lenny was untouchable. So in the 60s into the 70s, Vienna, the great bastion of art music, going back to Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Schubert, Mahler, Mendelssohn, Schumann, they all lived in Vienna at the pinnacle of their careers. And so the Vienna Philharmonic lends legitimacy to Bernstein. What does Bernstein lend them? We'll see in a second. This is Bernstein in the seminal work, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I just don't find him convincing in that repertoire. And that's what a lot of the accusations that the critics level, I believe, are about specifically older repertoire rather than Lenny's real wheelhouse. So why does the Vienna Philharmonic, a notoriously fickle ensemble, align itself with Bernstein? The first thing is we know that they never have a music director. They only have these special relationships with conductors because they are so well regarded in the orchestral world. The New Year's Eve concerts, which are bequeathed generation to generation, you cannot buy tickets for them because they are sold out years in advance. And as I say, they're often gifted to children and grandchildren within the same family. And the conductor for those New Year's Eve specials, which are televised, are always the most famous conductors of the day because it's going to net the greatest profit. So you can see the VPO is quite opportunistic. What do they get out of Lenny aside from his fame? Lenny, the ultimate Jew, who is so unflinching in his Jewishness, denazifies the Vienna Philharmonic, which was still 20 years after the war, reeling from a very unfavorable interpretation, especially in the West. His German was, he at one point he says, ach mein Deutsch, because he gets frustrated that he's not more fluent because he was speaking a Yiddish-inflected German that he had learned from his parents. What Lenny receives from the Vienna Philharmonic is legitimization and lionization exactly in the repertoire for which he has been denied legitimacy in America, which is the core of the canon, those Beethovens and Haydns and Brahmses. And what happens is that both of them get very rich. However, there is one more element to this story, which is Mahler. Mahler becomes the cornerstone of Bernstein's musical identity, and he takes Mahler from the symphonic margins and brings him to the center to make him the most famous and well-liked symphonist since Beethoven. And of course, this now, as a Mahler expert, elevates Bernstein to hitherto unknown levels of legitimacy and respect. Now, he may not have been the greatest Mahler interpreter because you could make arguments that Mengelberg, Klemperer, and Walter, all of whom knew Mahler personally. Klemperer and Walter had been Mahler's assistants. Mengelberg was his contemporary who gave the premiere of, amongst other things, the Fourth Symphony, and was a great confidant for Mahler, all of whom, incidentally, go on to become music directors of the New York Philharmonic later in their lives. So Bernstein might not have been the supreme interpreter, however, he was the supreme advocate. Here is a wonderful excerpt where he's convincing the Vienna Philharmonic, who would mumble under their breath as late as the 1960s, that das ist Scheiße Musik, this is shit music. This is the Vienna Philharmonic, which was still, as I say, recovering from its Nazi background during the war. They didn't like what they considered to be degenerate symphonic music. So let's have a look at how Bernstein convinces them of its significance and importance. I'll translate for you.
Ich weiß wohl, dass dies nur
I know this is just a rehearsal,
aber was
but
probieren
why do we
wir?
rehearse?
Die Noten können Sie
You can
spielen,
play the
das
notes, I
weiß
know
ich.
that.
Es ist Mahler, das
But
fehlt.
Mahler is missing.
Diese klagende, jedes Tremolo soll
Every tremolo, every
Maximum sein.
has to be played to the
Nein, ein
maximum.
Höhepunkt wie 18.
Like
hier.
here,
Man kann nicht so spielen.
can't
Mahler,
play
das
like
geht
this.
nicht. Das ist kein Mahler.
That's not Mahler.
Warum probiert man?
Why do we rehearse?
Es ist nur die Idee zu haben.
Just to get the idea? You
17.
can see how frustrated he is.
Bitte.
Please.
I don't care about your
I don't
Abstimmung.
care about your union rules.
Wir arbeiten oder
We're
wir
working
nicht.
or we're not working.
Wir werden keinen Maler haben.
He has to work.
There's no
He
way
has
to
to
play
work
3 bars.
so hard to convince them of the importance of Mahler's music. Of course, now that's moot because everyone recognizes the not infallible, but the extraordinary genius of Mahler. Bernstein says, I began to feel myself in direct contact with Mahler's message. Here's the extraordinary ending of the Second Symphony. And I'll use that word that I just took back, that Bernstein, in Mahler above all, was infallible. He was and remains one of the most important interpreters of Mahler's music ever to have lived. Now, we have to examine the Faustian bargain that Bernstein made. He became world famous. He was exceptionally wealthy. But at what cost? I want to conduct, I want to play the piano, I want to write music for Broadway and Hollywood, I want to write symphonic music, I want to teach, I want to write books and poetry, and I think I can and still do justice to them all. But could he, after we've done this examination? He was recurrently plagued by one criticism, that he spread himself too thin. So let's have a critical examination as the last step in our Bernstein exegesis. Let's have a look at his legacy. What did he leave behind? From Wunderkind to the middle of the establishment as music director of one of the great American orchestras, to ultimately elder statesman with the Vienna Philharmonic, amongst others. As conducted, the acolytes, the supporters and affirmers of Bernstein, would say that his interpretations and performances were emotional, intense, spontaneous, and inspiring. The cynics would say that they were indulgent, exaggerated, undisciplined, and excessive. As an interpreter, Joseph Horowitz, in 2018 for Bernstein's Centennial, says, "The late Bernstein style was combined intensity with massive weight, more slow than fast, more convoluted than straight. In Beethoven, in Brahms, in Schumann, in Mahler, invariably produced readings so different from anyone else's that they should have been controversial, but they were not." Which means what he's saying is that in the core repertoire, and I'm leaving Mahler out because I don't agree with you, Mr. Horowitz, in the core repertoire, Bernstein's interpretations were so different that they should have been noteworthy, but they were just dismissed as Lenny being Lenny. As composer, his popular music, like his theatre music, totally eclipses the symphonies. And West Side Story dominates everything. So again, it's another Faustian deal. He becomes so successful in this one West Side Story that everything else is eclipsed by it. As music director, the New York Philharmonic never acquired the luster, refinement, or sophistication of the competing other big five symphony orchestras in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Cleveland. It was big five in its budget and location only. As curator of modern American music, Bernstein inherits this mission from his teacher, Kusevitsky, whose midwifery saw this, and I'm going to list this extraordinary number of great masterworks that Kusevitsky brought into being either by commissioning them or by giving their premieres. Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra, Britten's opera Peter Grimes, Copland's Third Symphony, from which we have the ba-ba-bam, ba-ba-bam, the great fanfare for the common man, Messiaen's Turangalila Symphony, the Mussorgsky Ravel Pictures in Exhibition, the Ravel Piano Concerto, Stravinsky's Symphony of Psalms. If you aren't familiar with these pieces of music, that's the equivalent of listing works by Kandinsky and Picasso and Monet. They are the great masterworks of the early and mid-20th century. By contrast, Bernstein came up empty. And Bernstein himself says in the late 70s, "My greatest disappointment is that I have no composers to champion, no school to promote." The reason for this was Bernstein fundamentally distrusted contemporary American art music. You remember that sabbatical report. Pieces for nattering, clucking sopranos with squadrons of vibraphones, fleets of pianos played with the forearms, the fists, and the palms. Because Lenny went on writing anachronistic but approachable music throughout his career, be it serious or popular. He didn't subscribe to the avant-garde. And quite frankly, what has endured more? His music endures far more than those exercises in intellectual meanderings that was happening in the avant-garde in music in the mid-60s in America. Let's now have a look at the legacy, what he left behind, versus the impact, the intangible. If he could have sat down with every member of the human race and discussed at length matters musical, literary, philosophical, nothing would have made him happier. That's a quote from his daughter, Jamie. This is a quote from his freshman roommate at Harvard. Lenny wanted to love the whole world, and he tried to, but he also wanted the whole world to love him back, which pinpoints somewhat obliquely one of the lurking demons that pervades Lenny's psyche. His son Alexander says that toward the end of his career, he really started to dislike being Leonard Bernstein. There's a tragic thread that runs through some of Lenny's private writings where he's talking to his daughter, she mentions this in her recent book, Famous Father Girl. He loved word games. He loved anagrams and switching letters around. They did that a lot in the Bernstein household. And this particular anagram, Elf's Thread, reveals this torturous idea of self-hatred. That Lenny was plagued by this idea that he had let himself down. And not only that, that all of the public persona overwhelmed who he truly was, which is always the case with Faustian bargains. What do you give up for all of that? He needed it. It was an opiate to him. But what did he give up in the process? There is undoubted, however, posthumous establishment recognition of his contribution and his success. On the front cover of this tome, A History of Orchestral Conducting, we see Lenny's image. And even on his arch nemesis's book, The Great Conductors, on Harold C. Schonberg's book cover, there is Lenny's silhouette, unmistakable in the turtleneck. So his greatest achievements are West Side Story, the Young People's Concerts, his championship of hitherto lesser-known composers, Ives, Sibelius, Nielsen, Mahler, and becoming the universal ambassador for music as he does. In the final assessment, the impact far outweighs any critical detraction that any of those critics could level at him. And ultimately, Bernstein shapes music in America for generations and convinces millions the world over of the incredible power of classical music. This could only have been achieved by becoming music itself incarnate, by being the pianist, the composer, the conductor, the teacher, and the musicologist, the embodiment of music itself. I now leave you with a performance at the New Year's Eve concert in Caracas with Gustavo Dudamel again performing the mambo. Just watch the impact that it has on the audience and how infectious this music is to this day. This is the encore. So they're playing around now. is the person that Dudamel is most likened to but Bernstein? Who is the person when I'm at my absolute best, either on the podium or when I'm giving presentations like these? What is the ultimate compliment that people can give me? It's to compare me to Bernstein. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for being here.
Bravo.
Thank
Russell,
you.
that was amazing. You know, I was thinking about as you're presenting how much passion you display and that you see that in everything he did. Do you think he ever really realized the impact that he had?
Yeah, I do, because he was a rock star. In his lifetime,
Yeah.
he was the classical equivalent of the Beatles. And he couldn't go anywhere without being surrounded by like swarming crowds. He was, because he was not only a musical personality, he was on TV when TV first came to prominence. So he was as recognizable as who's a really famous TV presenter? I don't know, maybe Walter Cronkite or someone of that national standing, beloved. He was also, this idea of the Wunderkind, this Peter Pan thing. He was so young at heart. There's a famous photo of him sitting in the 60s on the grounds of Tanglewood. He's got white hair, which he wore so well, but he's sitting with like bracelets and and he's got hippies surrounding him at Tanglewood on the grass. So he knew how beloved he was, which made the disconnect between his that agonizing self-hatred, that agonizing existential crisis that he suffered, of not living up to his own potential, so tragic, because everyone loved him so much.
Yeah. That was amazing. You could see that in so many things. Paul, you had a question about his drama. You're on mute. You're on mute, Paul.
Sorry. Russell, do you think or know if he was as kind of dramatic and passionate in his life and in person as he portrayed in his work and his music and his conducting?
So there's a famous interview with Stephen Sondheim, who is the great lyricist and composer of many, many Broadway works, and who was actually the lyricist for West Side Story, and who collaborated very closely with Lenny, and who was one of Lenny's very good friends. And Sondheim tells the story that when Lenny was away from the maddening crowd, that he could be quiet and reflective, and there were moments of familial, they had a holiday house in Connecticut, and they would invite their close friends to be up there with the 3 children and Felicia, his wife. And there were moments where he could be like that the world never saw. But even then, there are these gorgeous home videos, and I think her name's actually pronounced Felicia, not Felicia. Felicia was this beautiful Latin American TV actress. And there are these gorgeous home videos where he and Felicia would dress up and do these like really hammy, over the top, like home video productions of whatever. And it's so cute and so domestic and so, but you can see even when it was just the 2 of them and they were doing it just for them, this great joie de vivre and exuberance and love of life. So I think that in characters like Lenny, that you can't be on stage, and I speak from experience, you can't be on stage and be this outsized personality without having that as being part of who you are anyway, and relishing that stage and that being able to have an outlet for all of that extra energy. But of course, there were these moments of quiet reflection. He comes as another story that Jamie tells when he was working on the opera Trouble in Tahiti, which was a torturous experience for him. He comes out from the composing house, which was like the garage, and he kisses the score and he says, I'm finished, puts it down safely, has a shot of vodka and jumps into the pool fully clothed. and then all the kids in Felicia do the same. So there's that element of him and the quiet all mixed up in this one place, this one character.
One mind.
I couldn't help but think as you were talking that, and I know there was a question related to this too, about the time in which he came of age, right? That he was there. How do you think it would have been in today's day and age as opposed to the tumultuous time?
No one's ever asked me that. That's a fantastic question. Without question, so Yannick Nézet-Séguin, he's a French-Canadian conductor who's in his mid to late 40s now. He's been on the world stage for 10 years or so, working at the highest level. He's music director of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he's the new music director of the Met. Yannick is an openly gay young man in a long-term relationship with a man. No one bats an eyelid. The Met, where James Levine had to hide his sexual orientation, the Philadelphia Orchestra, where a conservative bastion like Boston. Now he's out and proud, and there's no question about it. I think Lenny could have been out. And here's another element of contradiction in Lenny. Lenny was openly gay to those who knew him, but he also wanted at the same time the white picket fence and the family. Mm-hmm. And the only way to have that in the 40s or 50s was to get married and have children. And there's no doubt that he loved Felicia, but he had these demons that he was constantly battling. Nowadays, he wouldn't have to. He could have the family and be gay. I think that there's something so brilliant about his mind, something so magnetic about his personality, that he would have been successful today anyway. What made him the level of multi-millionaire many times over is that he was a TV personality, which led to recording contracts, which made him a household name. So certainly the television played a huge part in his fame and recognition.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
I'm sorry to interrupt. How do his children report him as a father?
Absent. They knew that he loved them very much, but when you think that he was out of the house 4 or 5 nights a week, either rehearsing or performing, that he was on tour for months at a time, and that his true love was music, and that the kids felt second to that. So Jamie, who published this book, had a nervous breakdown because she went into, she was a songwriter and a composer herself with no success. And one of the reasons that she did that was to get either posthumously or at the time her father's attention. Look, you can see he was filled with so much love. Like David Diamond said, he wanted to love the whole world. So 3 children occupied a specific space, but he had so much that he was doing that he didn't have time. Should we take one more question? Do we have any more questions?
I think that's it, right, Lynn?
All right.
Yeah, I think so. We have a member of a relative on who is watching today, whose family.
A relative of Bernstein?
Yes.
I just want to clarify one thing, which is that my talk is presented in this very critical lens, because I'm trying to be academically dispassionate about the subject matter. And I hope that what you see at the end is, despite all of these detractors that I present in an academic fashion, that what the effect and the impact that he had was so gargantuan that it didn't matter, that it washed them away. I hope that was clear. Which relative?
I don't know about the dispassionate part, though.
No, not unpassionate, dispassionate, objective. Thank you so much, Lynn and Kendall at
Thank
home
you.
and Paul for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you, and we will be having you back again later this year. So we hope that people will join us again. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. It was really an incredible honor. I'm just going to share one more slide to give a highlight here to our July 9th presentation, which will be on LGBTQ History 101 with the history projects. Joan and Paul, I'm going to ask you Ilaqua.
L'Aqua.
And that's Friday, July 9th at 11 a.m. So we hope you'll come back again for that and join us. Again, Russell, it was a great pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. And Paul, thanks for all your help as usual.
Okay.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Russell. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.